The billionaire CEO ruled boardrooms and bedrooms with his wallet. But when a maid refused his wealth, his pride took the first blow. But that rejection unlocked a love that changed his life forever. You don't want to skip a part of this very interesting story. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Boundless Echoes for more heartfelt stories. Richard Butler had just signed a deal worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes, and he felt absolutely nothing. The conference room on the 46th floor of Butler Global overlooked Manhattan like a throne above the city. Glass walls, steel accents, a table long enough to intimidate even the boldest executive. It was designed to remind everyone who held power here. The men and women seated around it were still smiling, still murmuring congratulations, still shaking hands as if they had just witnessed something historic. They had. Richard Butler, at 40, had closed the largest acquisition of his career. Another company swallowed whole. Another empire folded neatly into his own. "Congratulations, Mr. Butler," one of the board members said, admiration barely disguised as awe. "This changes everything." Richard stood, buttoning his tailored charcoal suit with slow precision. "It doesn't change anything," he replied coolly. "It just confirms what we already knew. That he always won." He didn't wait for applause. He never did. He left the room while the echoes of praise still lingered behind him, his leather shoes striking the marble floor with confident finality. His assistant hurried to keep up. "You have dinner at 8, she said, scrolling through her tablet. "And Ms. Reynolds called twice." Richard stopped at the elevator. "Cancel dinner. And tell Ms. Reynolds not to call again." There was no hesitation in his voice. No explanation required. The elevator doors slid shut, reflecting his image back at him. Tall, broad-shouldered, devastatingly handsome in a way that came from money, discipline, and the kind of confidence that had never known true defeat. Dark hair neatly styled, jaw sharp, eyes cold and calculating. Women loved him. Or at least, they loved what he represented. And he had learned long ago not to confuse desire with value. Later that night, Richard stood in his penthouse, the city glittering beneath his feet like something he owned outright. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire space, offering a panoramic view of New York that most people only saw in movies. The lights pulsed like a living thing, alive and restless, much like him. Behind him, a woman laughed softly, her voice lazy and expectant. "You're very quiet tonight," she said, slipping her arms around his waist. "Big day." Richard picked up his glass of whiskey and took a slow sip. "Something like that." She kissed his shoulder, her fingers tracing practiced patterns across his chest. She was beautiful. He knew that. Blonde, slender, impeccably dressed even after midnight. The kind of woman magazines featured and men envied. He felt nothing. When she finally looked up at him, searching his face for something more, he gently but firmly removed her hands. "I have an early morning," he said. "You should go." Her smile faltered. "Richard, I'll have my driver take you home." There was a moment of wounded pride, quickly masked by forced grace. She nodded, gathered her things, and left without another word. As the door closed behind her, silence reclaimed the penthouse. Richard exhaled slowly. This was his life. Power, wealth, access, and an emptiness he had long ago stopped trying to name. The next morning, Clara Hills stood in the service elevator, clutching a small leather notebook and a quiet prayer. She had been awake since dawn, nerves buzzing beneath her calm exterior. This job mattered. Not just because it paid well, though it did, but because it represented something more. Stability. A fresh start. Proof that she could stand on her own without owing anyone anything. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. Clara stepped out carefully, taking in the vastness of the space. The air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and polished wood. Sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating marble floors so pristine they reflected her image back at her. She adjusted her simple navy uniform and inhaled. "You belong here," she reminded herself. She had grown up learning how to be invisible when necessary, how to work quietly and efficiently without drawing attention. That skill had served her well. It would serve her now. She began with the kitchen, moving with practiced ease, cleaning, organizing, wiping surfaces until they gleamed. The silence was almost reverent, broken only by the soft hum of the city below. She didn't hear him enter. Richard stopped short when he saw her. She was standing by the kitchen counter, reaching up to wipe the top of a cabinet. The movement stretched her uniform just enough to draw his eye, and his gaze lingered despite himself. She wasn't dressed provocatively, yet everything about her presence felt striking. Her figure was naturally curvy, her posture confident without arrogance. Dark hair pulled back neatly, smooth brown skin glowing softly in the morning light. But it wasn't her body that truly caught his attention. It was the way she moved, unhurried, composed, as if she belonged here. She sensed him then and turned calmly. "Good morning, sir," she said politely. "I'm Clara Hills. I'll be handling housekeeping for the penthouse." No gasp, no flustered smile, no sudden straightening as if she'd just realized who he was. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Richard Butler," he said, watching closely for recognition. There was none. "Yes, sir," Clara replied, offering a small, professional smile before returning to her task. Richard leaned against the counter, intrigued despite himself. "You know who I am, don't you?" "Yes," she said simply. "My supervisor informed me." "That's it?" he asked. "No questions? No comments?" She glanced at him briefly. Should there be? For the first time in a long while, Richard found himself speechless. Most women reacted to him in one of two ways: exaggerated confidence or barely concealed awe. Clara did neither. She didn't flirt. She didn't shrink. She treated him like an employer, nothing more. And that unsettled him. Over the next few days, Richard found himself noticing her more than he intended. Clara arrived on time every morning, worked efficiently, and left without lingering. She didn't pry. She didn't gossip. She didn't attempt casual conversation unless spoken to. And even then, her responses were measured and thoughtful. She was polite, respectful, unimpressed. That last part bothered him. One afternoon, as she arranged fresh flowers in the living room, Richard spoke without looking up from his tablet. "You're not from New York." "No, sir." "Where then?" "Ohio," she replied. "A small town." He smirked. "Culture shock." She smiled faintly. "Only if you expect me to be shocked." He looked up then, studying her face. There was intelligence there, awareness, and something else he couldn't quite place. "You don't act like someone who needs this job," he said. "I need the job," Clara replied calmly. "I don't need to lose myself doing it." The words lingered between them. Richard said nothing more, but something shifted inside him, an irritation, sharp and unfamiliar. The offer came on a Friday evening. Richard had hosted a small gathering earlier, business associates, champagne, laughter that echoed hollowly through the penthouse. By the time the last guest left, the city outside was dark and glittering once more. Clara was finishing up, collecting empty glasses. "Leave that," Richard said. "I'll have someone else handle it." She paused. "It's part of my job, sir." He watched her for a moment, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick envelope. He placed it on the counter between them. Her eyes flicked to it, then back to him. "For your discretion," he said smoothly. "And your time." Silence. Clara stared at the envelope, then gently pushed it back toward him. "No, thank you." Richard frowned slightly. "You didn't even look inside." "I don't need to." His tone sharpened. "Do you understand what I'm offering you?" "Yes." "And you're saying no?" "I am." He straightened, disbelief flickering across his face. "Why?" Clara met his gaze steadily. "Because you think this," she gestured lightly to the envelope, "gives you the right to me. It doesn't." The room felt suddenly smaller. "You could walk away from here with more money than you've ever seen," Richard said, irritation creeping into his voice. "And still feel cheap," Clara replied quietly. She picked up her bag, hesitated only a moment, then added, "Good night, Mr. Butler." She left the envelope untouched. Richard stood there long after the door closed, staring at the counter as if the money had betrayed him. No woman had ever refused him like that. Not calmly. Not without fear. Not without apology. For the first time in his life, Richard Butler felt something dangerously close to embarrassment. And beneath it, a question that would not let him rest. What kind of woman says no to me? Sleep did not come easily to Richard Butler that night. He lay awake in his king-sized bed, the city glowing faintly through the glass walls, replaying the moment over and over again. The calm in her voice, the way she hadn't raised it, hadn't begged, hadn't hesitated. No, thank you. 2 words that had never been directed at him like that. He told himself it was nothing, just pride bruised, just irritation. He had faced rejection before. Rarely, but it had happened. Models who wanted more commitment. Socialites who played hard to get. But Clara Hills hadn't been playing anything. She hadn't tried to negotiate. She hadn't left the door open. She had simply refused, and walked away with her dignity intact. That was what gnawed at him. The next morning, Richard arrived later than usual. He found the penthouse already immaculate, sunlight streaming in, the faint scent of fresh coffee lingering in the air. Clara was in the living room, adjusting the cushions on the couch. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. "Good morning, Mr. Butler," she said evenly, as if nothing unusual had occurred. No awkwardness. No tension. No apology. Richard studied her closely. Her expression was calm, professional, unreadable. If she had spent the night thinking about him, she gave no sign of it. "You're not avoiding me," he said. "I don't have a reason to," Clara replied. That answer irritated him more than silence would have. "You understand," he said slowly, "that most people would have jumped at that offer." Clara nodded. "I understand. Then why didn't you?" She considered him for a moment, as if weighing whether the truth was worth giving. Then she spoke. "Because I've seen what happens when people let money decide their worth," she said quietly. "And I decided a long time ago that wouldn't be me." Richard folded his arms. "You think I was trying to buy your worth?" "I think you were trying to buy my consent," Clara corrected gently. "There's a difference." Her words landed with precision, not cruelty, but they struck something deep. "You're very confident for someone in your position," he said. "And you're very uncomfortable with that," she replied. Silence stretched between them. Richard exhaled sharply, more unsettled than he cared to admit. "You're dismissed for the day." Clara nodded once. "As you wish, sir." She left without another word. The days that followed only deepened Richard's restlessness. He found himself watching the clock, listening for the soft sounds of her presence. He noticed small things he'd never paid attention to before. The way she organized his space with thoughtful precision, the quiet hum she made while working, the way she never once invaded his privacy. Other women texted, called, sent invitations and photos meant to provoke a reaction. None of it worked. One afternoon, Richard overheard a conversation between 2 staff members in the hallway. She turned him down. One whispered incredulously, "Flat out." "No way," the other replied. "Richard Butler?" Richard paused unseen. "Didn't even take the money," the first continued. "Just said no and walked out." There was admiration in the whisper. Respect. Something twisted uncomfortably in his chest. That evening, Richard found Clara in the kitchen again, preparing to leave. "Clara," he said, stopping her. She turned. "Yes, Mr. Butler? I owe you an apology." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she said nothing. "I crossed a line," he continued. "I shouldn't have made that offer." She studied his face, searching for sincerity. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. "Thank you," she said. "I accept." Just like that. No lecture. No triumph. "You're unusual," Richard added. A small smile touched her lips. "I get that a lot." For the first time since she had arrived, Richard smiled too, genuinely. As Clara stepped into the elevator, Richard remained where he was, watching the doors close. He had built his life on certainty, on the belief that money gave him power over outcomes, over people, over desire. But Clara Hills had introduced uncertainty. And Richard Butler was beginning to realize that uncertainty might be the most dangerous and irresistible thing he had ever encountered. Richard Butler had always believed that distance was control. If you kept people at arm's length, employees, lovers, even friends, you stayed powerful. You stayed untouchable. That belief had carried him through decades of ruthless ambition and sleepless nights, through betrayals disguised as partnerships and relationships built on convenience rather than truth. But distance did nothing now. Not when Clara Hills occupied the same space and somehow remained entirely out of his reach. The apology he had offered her should have settled things. In his experience, apologies restored order. They reset the balance of power. Yet with Clara, nothing reset. If anything, something had shifted further out of alignment. She treated him exactly the same as before, respectful, efficient, calm. No softness. No resentment. No hint that she felt triumphant. And that disturbed him. Richard began finding excuses to stay home. Meetings were postponed. Conference calls shortened. He told himself it was efficiency. Delegation was a skill, after all, but deep down he knew the truth. He wanted to observe her, to understand her. Clara arrived each morning, just before 8. She moved through the penthouse with quiet confidence, cleaning, organizing, restoring order without imposing herself on the space. She didn't wear makeup beyond the bare minimum. Her hair was always neatly pulled back. Nothing about her appearance was designed to seduce. Yet everything about her presence drew his attention. One morning, he watched from the hallway as she carefully dusted a shelf of framed photographs he rarely noticed. Old pictures. Ones he hadn't looked at in years. She paused at one. A photo of a younger Richard with his father, both dressed in suits that didn't quite fit yet. The expression on his father's face was proud. The one on Richard's was guarded even then. Clara didn't linger. She simply set the frame back into place with care. "Most people skip that shelf," Richard said from behind her. She turned, surprised but not startled. It looked like it mattered. He nodded slowly. "It used to." She waited, giving him space to continue. When he didn't, she simply returned to her work. It struck him then, she never forced intimacy. She allowed it, and that made all the difference. Their conversations grew slowly, organically. Sometimes it was about nothing at all. Music playing softly from her phone as she worked, a book she'd left on the counter by mistake, the way the seasons felt different in New York than in Ohio. Other times, the conversations surprised him. "You don't seem impressed by wealth," Richard said one afternoon as she poured herself a glass of water. "I'm impressed by how people treat others when no one is watching," Clara replied. "And how do you think I do?" he asked. She met his gaze honestly. "You're learning." It wasn't an insult. It wasn't praise. It was a statement of fact. Richard found himself laughing, a short, incredulous sound. "You're not afraid of me at all, are you?" Clara considered the question. "I respect your position," she said. "But fear and respect aren't the same thing." "No," he agreed quietly. "They're not." The change in Richard did not go unnoticed. His staff whispered about it, about the way he lingered in conversations instead of dismissing them, about how he corrected people without humiliation now, about the noticeable absence of women coming and going from the penthouse. One evening, his longtime friend and business associate, Marcus Hale, stopped by unannounced. "You're disappearing," Marcus said, glancing around the penthouse. "Board thinks you've gone soft." Richard poured 2 drinks. "Let them think whatever they want." Marcus smirked. "Is this about the maid?" Richard's hand stilled. "Careful," he said calmly. Marcus raised both hands. "Relax. Word travels fast, that's all. Man like you doesn't get turned down every day." "I wasn't turned down," Richard said coolly. Marcus laughed. "You offered money." She said no. "That's turned down." Richard didn't respond. Marcus took a sip of his drink, studying him more carefully now. "What is it about her?" Richard stared out at the city. "She doesn't want anything from me." Marcus frowned. "Everyone wants something." "Not her," Richard said. "And that terrifies me more than I want to admit." Marcus shook his head. "Just don't confuse fascination with feeling." Richard didn't answer, because he was no longer sure where one ended and the other began. Clara felt the shift too. She wasn't naive. She knew a man like Richard Butler didn't change overnight, and she knew power had a way of distorting intention. That was why she guarded her heart so carefully. Still, there were moments, small, unguarded ones, that caught her off balance. Like the day she found Richard in the kitchen at midnight, sleeves rolled up, struggling to cook. "You're going to burn that," she said gently. He glanced at the pan, grimacing. "I'm beginning to see why people hire professionals." She smiled despite herself. "Move." She showed him how to lower the heat, how to season properly, how patience mattered more than force. "Funny," he said quietly, watching her hands. "That applies to more than cooking." She met his eyes. "It usually does." Another time, she found him sitting alone on the balcony long after sunset, staring into the dark. "Do you ever feel lonely?" she asked before she could stop herself. He didn't answer right away. "Yes," he said finally. "But I'm very good at pretending I'm not." That honesty startled her more than any flirtation could have. The turning point came at a charity gala. Richard had insisted Clara attend, not as staff, but as a guest. He made it clear there was no obligation, no pressure. She hesitated for hours before agreeing. When she arrived, the room fell into a stunned hush. Clara wore a simple emerald dress that hugged her curves without screaming for attention. Her hair fell softly around her shoulders. She looked elegant, confident, untouchable. Richard watched her cross the room, something tight and unfamiliar gripping his chest. "She cleans your penthouse?" A woman scoffed loudly nearby. "You have an interesting taste in charity cases." Before Clara could respond, Richard stepped forward. "Watch your mouth," he said coldly. "Or leave." The room went silent. The woman flushed, murmured an apology, and disappeared into the crowd. Richard turned to Clara. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her eyes shone. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me." That night, as they stood side by side under the glow of chandeliers and polite applause, something irrevocable shifted between them. They were no longer employer and employee. They were two people standing on the edge of something dangerous. Later, alone on the balcony overlooking the city, Richard spoke the words he had been holding back. "I don't want to own you," he said quietly. "I don't want control. I don't even want certainty." Clara's heart pounded. "What do you want, Richard?" "I want the chance to be chosen." Silence stretched between them, heavy with truth. Clara turned to face him fully. "If you lost everything tomorrow," she asked softly, "your money, your power, your name, who would you be?" The question cut deeper than any rejection ever had. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in his life, he didn't know the answer. Clara stepped back, emotion flickering across her face. "When you figure that out," she said gently, "then we can talk." She walked away, leaving Richard alone with the city, and a truth he could no longer escape. The question followed Richard Butler everywhere. If you lost everything tomorrow, who would you be? It echoed in boardrooms and empty hallways, in the quiet hum of his penthouse at night, in the reflection staring back at him from mirrored glass. For the first time since he had built his empire, Richard felt exposed. Not because something had been taken from him, but because something had been revealed. He had no answer. Not yet. The morning after the gala, Clara did not come to work. Richard noticed immediately. By noon, the penthouse felt wrong. Too quiet, too sterile, stripped of the subtle warmth her presence had brought into the space. He told himself it was coincidence. A scheduled day off. A sick day. But unease settled in his chest. He called his supervisor. "She requested a transfer," the woman said carefully. "Effective immediately." Richard closed his eyes. "Why wasn't I told?" "She asked that you not be." The line went dead. For the first time in years, Richard Butler felt panic. Not the calculated anxiety of market volatility or hostile takeovers, but something raw, personal, and frightening. He had always believed control meant possession. Now he was learning that love, if that was what this was, meant letting go. Days passed. Clara moved into a modest apartment in Brooklyn, returning to a simpler routine. She took a position at a small boutique hotel, one that paid less but offered peace. She needed distance, not because she didn't care, but because she cared too much. Richard respected her choice. That was how he knew he had changed. He didn't send gifts. He didn't call in favors. He didn't use his power to pull her back into his orbit. Instead, he turned inward, confronting parts of himself he had long ignored. He canceled social engagements. Stopped chasing validation. He began therapy, quietly, without announcement, unearthing the roots of his emptiness. A father who had taught him success but not affection. A childhood where love was conditional. A man who learned early that money was the safest language to speak. Without Clara there, the truth was impossible to avoid. Then the crisis came. A major investor pulled out unexpectedly, triggering a chain reaction that sent Butler Global's stock tumbling overnight. Media speculation exploded. Headlines questioned Richard's leadership for the first time in his career. Board members demanded emergency meetings. "This company is you," one of them said bluntly. "And right now you're distracted." Richard didn't argue. For the first time, he didn't hide behind dominance. He listened. And when the pressure mounted, when old instincts urged him to bulldoze through the problem alone, he hesitated. Then he did something unthinkable. He reached out to Clara. Not for comfort, for perspective. They met in a quiet cafe far from Wall Street, far from penthouses and power. She looked different, lighter, freer. Happier. "I won't ask you to fix anything," Richard said after a long silence. "I just need to think out loud." She nodded. "I can listen." He explained the situation, his voice stripped of arrogance. When he finished, Clara spoke gently. "You built something massive," she said. "But you built it alone. Maybe that's the problem." Richard frowned. "Strength is independence." "No," she replied. "Strength is knowing when to trust." The words hit him harder than any market loss. That night, Richard restructured, not just the company, but himself. He delegated real authority, invited collaboration, accepted vulnerability. The crisis stabilized. The empire survived. But more importantly, something else was born. Weeks later, Richard stood on the balcony of a small beach house in California, the ocean stretching endlessly before him. He had rented it, not for business, not for escape, but for clarity. Clara arrived at sunset. No drivers. No security. Just them. "I know who I'd be," Richard said before she could speak. She waited. "I'd still be a man who wants to build, who wants to lead. But I wouldn't be someone who measures his worth by what he owns, or who he can buy." He turned to face her fully, eyes steady. "I'd be someone who chooses you, and someone worthy of being chosen." Clara's breath caught. He didn't reach for her, didn't kneel, didn't offer anything except truth. "I love you," he said simply. "Not because you're different, but because you showed me who I could be." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't need your empire," she whispered. "I need your honesty." Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. No diamonds blinding enough to distract. Just a ring, elegant, timeless. "I don't want to own your life," he said softly. "I want to share mine. Will you marry me?" Clara didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. "I will." The wedding was quiet. No headlines. No billion-dollar spectacle. Just close friends, open skies, and vows spoken from the heart. Richard stood across from Clara, hands trembling. Not from fear, but from awe. "I spent my life thinking power meant control," he said. "You taught me that real power is love freely given." Clara smiled through tears. "And you taught me that even the most guarded hearts can change." When they kissed, it wasn't ownership. It was partnership. Years later, people still whispered about Richard Butler's transformation. About the billionaire who had once treated love like a transaction, and found happiness only when he stopped trying to buy it. But those who knew the truth understood something deeper. The one thing money couldn't buy was the very thing that changed everything. And when Richard Butler finally let go of his wealth as a weapon, he gained something priceless. A woman who chose him. A life built on love. And a heart that was finally free. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, share, and and subscribe to Boundless Echoes for more interesting stories. We really appreciate your support. Comment where you are watching from, so we can give you a shout out. See you in our next video.